Thank you for joining us for today's Leader in Philanthropy program. I would now like to welcome Mary Weingartner, Director of Donor Relations at the University of Chicago, to begin the program.
Thank you so much, Adam. I am so delighted to be here with all of you, and I want to welcome you to today's Leaders in Philanthropy program featuring William Howell, the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics. I'm delighted to welcome Leaders in Philanthropy members and their guests to tonight's lecture. For those of you who have attended our in-person events, I say welcome back. For those whose cities we haven't been fortunate enough to visit with our live events, I extend a very warm welcome. We have attendees from around the globe, and I'm delighted we can all be together, albeit virtually. Tonight, we're here to recognize and celebrate members of our Leaders in Philanthropy giving societies, and those are the Maroon Loyalty Society, the Chicago Society, the Odyssey Scholarship Society, the Harper Society, and the Phoenix Society. The impact of your support is immeasurable. I truly don't have words to adequately express how grateful we are for your support. As we kick off tonight's exclusive event for our Leaders in Philanthropy members and their guests, I want to encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now I have two introductions to make. The first is our evening's moderator, Steve Edwards, who will join the discussion at the Q&A portion. Steve is Chief Content Officer and Interim CEO at WBEZ, Chicago Public Media. Previously, he spent nearly 20 years as an award-winning journalist and program host. His work has appeared on the BBC, Bloomberg News, PBS, and numerous public radio stations around the United States. From 2012 to 2017, Steve Edwards served as Executive Director of the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, where he oversaw all programming and operational duties, including its acclaimed public event series, professional fellowships, career and civic engagement programs, and the Axe Files podcast in partnership with former presidential advisor David Axelrod and CNN. Steve earned his BA in political science from Amherst and was a Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. I now have the pleasure to introduce William Howell. He is the director of the Center for Effective Government, co-host of Not Another Politics podcast, the Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the University of Chicago, and chair of the Political Science Department. He holds additional appointments in the Harris School of Public Policy and the college. Professor Howell has written widely on separation of powers issues and American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, and his most recent book, Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, published by UChicago Press and written with Terry Moe, is the topic of tonight's conversation. Professor Howell is the recipient of many academic awards, including the Legacy Award for Enduring Research on Executive Politics, and was recently inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before coming to the University of Chicago, Professor Howell taught in the government department at Harvard University and in the political science department at the University of Wisconsin. He received a PhD in political science from Stanford University and a BA from Wesleyan University. And without further ado, I turn the virtual podium over to Professor Howell.
Well, thank you, Mary. What a pleasure to be here with you, if only virtually, and with this community of people who care about this university and are invest their time and their commitments to making it all that it is. I'm really delighted also to have a chance to be in conversation with my friend Steve Edwards, who is, there's nobody better at this. He's going to be our faithful steward through the conversation that we're about to have. And I'm keen for us to have a conversation and to have some engagement, because this book, here it is, this book which just came out, I mean, I got my copy about a week ago, it has an argument. It's an argument that tries to make sense of this present political moment, that challenges it, that it presents to us, and what we need to do to meet those challenges. And it's an argument that invites engagement. It invites exchange. And frankly, to the extent that we're going to do the things that I think that we need to do in order to put this country on stronger footing vis-a-vis its democracy, it's going to require people to think seriously about the threats that stand before us and what we need to do about them. And so what I want to do is take a few minutes. I'll talk for about 8 to 10 minutes about to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of the argument of the book. And then what Steve and I can do is kind of revisit individual points and individual connections between those points to see whether or not they pass muster and to see how far they take us and to see what kind of claims it makes about the stakes of the coming presidential election and about the work that lies ahead. And so I want to start with what I think is to my mind, is a point about which I suspect there's broad agreement among the people who are on this call, which is that democracy is under threat within the United States and it's on its heels. And you see that in a whole host of ways. You see that in terms of threats being made to democratic norms, efforts to delegitimize our political institutions, be they free and independent press, be it the status of parties and the legitimacy of parties that are contending with one another, be it with regard to a free and independent judiciary that's going to pass judgment on actions that are taken in particular by the president. In important ways, we see the undermining of these norms and in some cases, steadfast efforts to break down rules and to marginalize institutions. And this is a cause of real concern. And so I want to simply sort of note that as kind of observation number one. And observation number two is that while our president, Donald Trump, is the most visible embodiment of those threats, the phenomenon is much larger than Donald Trump. And that's true for a host of reasons. In part, and in large part, what we lay out in the first couple chapters of the book is that what Donald Trump does is he channels a kind of populism that is corrosive to democracy and that is not unique to him. It's something that we observe arising in Europe. There's a long and storied history of populism within Latin America. And it is something that has taken hold within our country that is fomented by widespread public disaffection, widespread anger towards our political institutions. There's a long history of populism and the threats that it presents to democracy that is larger than simply the outcome of the 2016 election and the last 3.5 years of governance under Donald Trump. Now, we have a lot to say about the particular kinds of things that he's doing and what we ought to do about them. But we want to recognize the phenomenon and the threats to democracy as being something much larger than him, and that therefore, should he not be reelected in the coming election, that isn't going to constitute an immediate correction to the kinds of threats that are presented to our democracy. There's a lot more work lies ahead. So that's observation number two. Observation number one is democracy is on its heels. Observation number two is the most visible embodiment of the threat is Donald Trump, but the threat is much larger than Donald Trump. And in large part, it's about the populism that is emergent, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. Observation number three, which I want to start off by identifying as being kind of separate, and then I'm going to connect it to the other two, is that we have a government that quite by design is ineffective at attending to complex, hard, challenging, modern problems. And we see that, the evidence of that in kind of stark relief when you think about what's happened over the last 3 to 4 months vis-a-vis this pandemic and the capacity of our political institutions to meet this challenge and to offer a meaningful solution to it. That the pandemic itself is something not of the government's making, but how we coordinate a people in order to formulate and the kind of coordinated and effective response decidedly is the stuff of government activity. And there, I want to suggest, we have a set of institutions that are simply ill-equipped to meet these kinds of challenges. And they're ill-equipped for institutional reasons, and for reasons that are born into the very fabric of our Constitution. You see the evidence of this being played out in the failure, frankly, over the last 40 years of the government to meet all sorts of modern challenges associated rising inequality between the rich and the poor. Modern challenges as in dealing in a coherent, thoughtful way about how to attend to population movements, how to write a tax code that actually makes sense, how to attend to rising debt and entitlement reform and the challenges of the long-term viability of public entitlements to attend. I mean, these are not, and in a warming climate, right? These are not new issues. These are new, but they are issues that our government has struggled and struggled mightily to attend to in a serious-minded way. So we've got these three observations now. Democracy is on its heels. Most visible embodiment of the threat is Donald Trump, but it's much bigger than that. And then this recognition that government is ineffective, and it's ineffective by institutional design. And what I want to now do is sort of piece some of these things together. And the first thing is to say is that populism thrives amidst government dysfunction. That the second point is related to the third point. That the reason why the kinds of arguments that Donald Trump offered in 2016 about our broken system, our rigged system, a system that had failed to meet the needs of average citizens and that was bankrupt to its core, and that what we needed to do was drain the swamp, and that he presented himself, as populists are wont to do, as the kind of outsider that stands apart from the political wreckage, which is the existing political order. That those kinds of arguments, populist arguments of that form, resonate amidst and in the aftermath of sustained political failure to attend to problems that significant portions of the American electorate recognize as being the legitimate subjects of public action, right? Now, another thing that populists do once they assume office, when they grab a hold of the apparatus of government, is that rather than sort of rolling up their sleeves and solving the problems that they've identified as the kind of the subject of government failure, and the reason why people are legitimately angry and disaffected, is that they don't roll up their sleeves and set a course where they actually solve the problems, where they constructively reconstitute the political order. Rather, what they do is they propagate that disruption. They sow that continued disaffection. And in that way, the kinds of challenges to democracy that the rise of populists, that populism presents, are only exacerbated when a populist actually occupies the office. Okay, so then the question is, what do we do about it, right? What does it mean to address these threats? And what I want to suggest is that if we're going to responsibly attend to the very real threat that populism presents to democracy, what we need to do is get into the business of institutional reform. Because the government ineffectiveness that is such a sort of a defining feature of the government, particularly in the modern era, and I say that because the expectations of government have gone so, have escalated to such an extraordinary extent, and the challenges that are presented to it are unbelievably complex. I mean, how you effectively meet, the challenges of a pandemic from a governance standpoint is like profoundly difficult. But if what we're going to do then is meet this threat, we need to get into the business then of rethinking our institutions and reconstituting our institutions that in many ways we've inherited from a bygone era, right? The institutions that we have today, when you think about the national government in particular, look a good deal like the institutions we had at the time of the nation's founding, wherein our nation consisted of, 3.7 million people, 700,000 of whom were slaves. The government was expected to do very, very little, and in fact did very, very little. And the only people who exercised political power were white propertied men. The institutions that they built for their age are in large part the institutions that we've inherited. And they will not do to meet the challenges that we now face. So what we need to then do is to think about institutional reform. And then what the book does, our book does here, is it thinks seriously about the kinds of reforms that are needed for the American presidency in particular. There's all kinds of talk about the need for political rejuvenation and change. We want to cast our attention squarely on the American presidency. And that's in part because we see presidents by design as offering a kind of leadership that is in short supply, that we need to find ways of constructively and productively leveraging in the service of solving problems on the one hand. And it also is true, we need to think about the presidency because the presidency is, in important ways, the biggest threat to our democracy, particularly when a populace holds the office, right? And so the challenge before us then when we think about institutional reform is to think about how do we attend to both the threat that presidents face, right, present, the kind of fear that we should justifiably have when we think about vesting more authority in the presidency on the one hand, against, on the other, the need to leverage presidential leadership because we need the presidency and the kinds of unique leadership that they stand to offer in order to attend to modern problems, big, complex, national, if not international, modern problems. And so what the book does then is it offers kind of a template for how we think about those institutional reforms. It lays out a set of specific reforms that we would like to see adopted and minimally talked about. Here we are this evening, I hope we can. And in turn, recognize the very real political impediments to their adoption, to take seriously that we don't come into this with, starry eyes thinking, well, now that we've identified the right reforms, obviously, naturally, they will be adopted. We need to take seriously the kind of cultural and political and partisan impediments to serious-minded institutional reform in order to create the kind of modern presidency that we need so that we can build a more effective government, so that we can beat back the threat that populism presents, so that we can rejuvenate and hold on to our democracy and its many ambitions. So let me stop there. That you can see it's a thumbnail sketch, kind of gives you some sense of the argument of the book, and invite Steve Edwards to join the conversation, and let's see if we can't drill down a little bit together.
Will, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And I should say, in the spirit of a conversation, I just want to reiterate what Mary said at the outset. We invite you to use the Q&A function here on the Zoom call to be sharing your questions. Many of you have already done so. And there have been a number of questions just regarding populism. So I want to spend some time on the remedies that you and your co-author Terry Moe propose. But let's stay with populism and the problem of it for just a second, which, as you allude to, it's not unique to the United States. It's also not a new phenomenon. The ancient Greeks recognized it, as you write. The founders were aware of it and tried to solve for it in certain ways, perhaps oversolved in your argument. And you write that democracy structurally does contain the seeds of its own destruction. One of the questions from one of our attendees tonight is really about what is it then that makes this populist moment and this populist movement, to the extent it is behind the current president, different from populist movements that have been unsuccessful at reaching the presidency in the past?
So there's so much embedded in here. Let me point out a couple of things. The first thing I think that we might want to do is define populism so that we're all clear what we're talking about here, because it's not what we have in mind. My co-author, who I should have mentioned earlier, Terry Moe, who was my dissertation advisor some time ago and has been a long time friend and co-author over the years. He's from Stanford. What we have in mind and what scholars have in mind when we talk about populism is not the way in which populism is used in the popular press. It's sort of people standing up for the little guy and saying the people have been ignored and let's break down, barriers to their involvement and their influence in our politics. there are elements of that, but what populism really is about is it is a deep critique, a wholesale critique of a political order that assumes a rhetoric that completely delegitimizes an existing regime. And it leaves no space for any engagement except by a political outsider, and that the ploy that the outsider deploys is to say, vest your hopes and aspirations in me. I'm going to be the one that's going to solve it, right? Because everything over there is broken and corrupt. And so you can already see how what starts off as a recognition that, oh, people have been ignored, I'm here to help you, but vest your hopes in me is an invitation to demagoguery. And it leads to the corrosion of not just political norms, but political processes and democratic kind of rules that govern what it means to invite a larger polity to make hard decisions about how we meet modern challenges. So I think that's sort of, when we think about where is the threat, therein lies the threat. And you can then see how that's born of political failure, right? It's when do those arguments kind of really resonate about how everything's corrupt, how it's all rigged? They resonate in the aftermath of, in some other countries, widespread periods of corruption. Reference what's happened in Brazil, or what happened in Venezuela, or in Italy. Perceptions of, that modern challenges are overrunning the capacity of governments. Then think about the interaction between immigration flows and the electoral fortunes of populists in Europe. So here are elements of it, and why we see both what populism is, why we see it as a threat, and how it's connected to ineffective government.
Right. So what we have here is we have a period of significant socioeconomic convulsion and a period of really ineffective government enabled in its ability to meet the challenges of the modern world. But is there something particular about that combination with this president and the media environment that put that together to elevate Donald Trump to the presidency when past moments of disruption, which you write about, were less successful in achieving the White House?
Yes. So past moments, you've seen populist claims being kind of levied by others. And what the response was in the progressive era was massive institutional reform in effort to reconstitute the government such that it could meet modern challenges in the late 19th, early 20th century. You see that in the Great Depression, wherein there's all kinds of concerns about the capacity of our governing system to meet the challenges presented by an economy in free fall. And the response was to have a big D and a small d Democrat assume office and then leverage the power of the office in order to meet those anxieties, right? What we have in this moment, what makes it so challenging, is that in the aftermath of the failure, the populace has breached the gates and has grabbed hold of the levers of government. And we see, Terry and I see, the presidency as playing a really important role institutionally in solving problems, in being a kind of paragon of effective government. And now those levers of power are being wielded by a populist who, I've just told you, is in the business not of solving problems, but of dismantling democracy, sowing disaffection, right? Propagating continued anger for his own electoral gains. And that this presents profound challenges. It presents a real reckoning that we have to grapple with.
There are a lot of questions about the moment and about populism, but I want to pivot because there are a number of questions really about the remedy and the argument you propose, and I don't want to lose sight of that in all of this. One of the things that on its surface may seem counterintuitive, given what you just described, is the argument that you and Terry Moe make around reform involves strengthening the office of the president, strengthening the executive branch. So help us understand how you think about that and why that would be an effective reform at a time when many people are concerned about too much power residing with the executive who's currently in office.
Yes, it's a terrific question. I mean, it's something, this is the reason why we wrote the book. It was to try to meet this particular concern and the challenges that it presents. And I think a place to start is to recognize that presidents offer a kind of leadership that's very different from the kind of representation that we observe within Congress. That presidents by design, now here the thing to do is not to reason from your favorite president or from your favorite, senator, or your least favorite president or your least favorite senator, but to rather think about the design of the institution, right? And that presidents, by virtue of where they sit, cast their attention to a greater extent on the nation as a whole. Not perfectly, but to a greater extent than does any other elected official in our national government. And because they care so much about legacy, right? They care about where, how they're going to be talked about, not just now, but, in the decades hence. They think about the long-term implications of the decisions that they made. Not perfectly. This isn't to say they always get it right? And it's not to say that they don't have other kinds of kind of parochial or partisan concerns that also find their way into their thinking, but that to a greater extent than do certainly legislators, you see attention to national long-term considerations. Whereas in Congress, you see local short-term considerations running wild, which is why if you're looking for Congress to provide the kind of solution to this pandemic, the kind of leadership, the kind of coordination that we need in order to meet the profound challenges that this pandemic presents, or back up a level, rising inequality between the rich and the poor, or a warming climate. We just don't see it. We don't see it. It's not where you're going to find it. We need presidents in important ways to provide a certain kind of leadership. And so what you're doing is you're saying, oh my God, presidents are a threat. What we should therefore do is shut presidents down, because any reduction in their power is going to keep demagoguery at bay and preserve our democracy. You're missing sight of the need for an effective government, the role that presidents can play in that, and the very reason why Trump rose to power in the first place was in. And so it's really a dilemma. It's a profound dilemma. You're not going to get out of just by saying shut down the president, but you're also not going to get out of it just by saying, all power to the president. You have to find ways of reasoning through selectively what powers you want to give.
Let's talk specifically then about what you call for here. A number of you with us in this conversation want to know specifically about the kinds of reforms that you propose. You say recrafting the presidency for modern times. So what are some examples of some essential reforms in your view?
So on the positive side, in the sense that presidential enhancements, right, it is that we make the argument that the president should have enhanced agenda setting powers in the legislative process. Right now, the key agenda setters, the sole agenda setters, are party leaders within Congress, and they can choose or not to bring bills forward to a vote. And you see as a result, all kinds of bills passing within the House that don't receive any attention in the Senate because McConnell won't bring them forward for a vote, and vice versa. And we argue that presidents, by virtue of having this kind of different kind of leadership that they stand to offer, ought to be included among the agenda setters, and that they ought to be given the power to say, here is something that you, Congress, have to take seriously. You have to vote on. You're free to vote it down. But if you don't vote it down, it's automatically going to become law. So ignoring it is not benign. You have to take a position on these things. That's the one enhancement that we have, that we see as a constructive way of leveraging presidential leadership, recognizing, again, the very real threat that presidents can face when a demagogue holds office. And we don't think that this particular allowance, were Trump to have it, would make much difference, because what Trump is in the main doing is exercising these unilateral powers, which we don't call for an enhancement of. If anything, when all the other reforms have to do with curtailing and constraining. So some of it has to do with changing the emergency powers that are available to presidents. We can talk about those. Some of it has to do with reducing the politicization of the executive branch. That is, giving presidents the ability to appoint their cronies and pure loyalists throughout the administrative state, and then of particular concern within the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies. We also call for the elimination, which would require a constitutional amendment, of the president's pardon power, So it's a mix of things, right? It's in part enhanced agenda setting power, but it also is a reduction of other powers that are given to the presidency, which has to do with reconstituting the presidency as a whole. It's kind of reimagining the presidency for modern times.
One of the things that somebody's put forth as a question relates to the notion of checks and balances, fundamental to the representative system of government that the founders set forth in the Constitution. And the question, I'll just read it verbatim rather than summarizing as I have with the others, says, "But we have utterly failed at constraining this president. I don't believe in relying on inherent goodness beyond the checks you just described, Will. What kinds of checks can we have? In essence, what are the appropriate checks on an expanded executive? One, in this case, who has flouted many, not just of the norms, but some of the checks that have existed within the Constitution."
For sure, it's a great question. And I'll say, I don't either vest any kind of faith in the goodwill of the individuals who occupy positions of power, nor did our founders. That they were, to their core, realists in designing this system of government, and they wanted to see it thrive, recognizing fully all the vanity and imperfections and ambitions of individuals who would occupy positions of power. I'll say, there are two stories to tell about the Trump presidency. One is about him running roughshod over democratic norms and presenting a very real threat to democracy. The other one is of a president who has been checked left and right, even in domains in which presidents historically have exercised a tremendous amount of influence, such as in setting rules and determinations over who's allowed within the country. So from the get-go, right, with his Muslim ban, you see the courts pushing back in lots of ways. You see a refusal on the part of Congress to fund his wall. You see all kinds of ways in which this president has met defeat by either bureaucrats or legislators or justices and judges who refuse to do their bidding. What are some of them the checks that we want to see? I mean, again, this goes to like the politicization of the executive branch. Let me just pick that. Let me pick two. That's one. Presidents right now, to our mind, simply have the formal authority to make too many political appointments to the administrative state. And that's something by statute that we could change. We're a huge outlier relative to other industrialized countries, and just in terms of the number of political appointments that we allow for. And rather than giving this president this many, we could put rules in place that cut it back by a half. Make the attorney general not an appointed position by the president, have there be an independent commission or that's subject to party balancing requirements that goes ahead and selects who the attorney general is going to be. So there's one. On emergency powers, let me just flag this one because it's an interesting one. Presidents, by declaring an emergency, automatically can lay claim to new powers that allow them to do things like, as Trump has done, reallocate or claim to be able to reallocate funds that have been appropriated for a certain purpose to instead fund a wall that Congress has repeatedly refused to fund, okay? So, and there's nothing that requires the president when declaring an emergency to then secure Congress's formal endorsement. But there's no reason why we couldn't require as much. We couldn't say, look, you can declare an emergency, but after a set period of time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if you fail to get Congress to authorize that declaration, the powers that you've laid claim to automatically lapse, right? And that's something which could be formally done, which would constitute a profound check on these emergency powers while still giving the president important flexibility to respond to sudden crises, which I think we do want a president who's able to do that. So those are two, right, in which they constitute very real checks on executive authority.
Yeah, you mentioned also before the agenda setting powers, and I just want you to elaborate a little bit further because I think many of us would look at the presidency and say, hey, they have the bully pulpit. They are really driving the agenda. I mean, you take immigration and whether the policies have been fully implemented in the way that this White House wants them to be or not. There's no question that immigration is at the center of the national conversation and the national policy debate, and that's really driven by the White House. So help us understand what specifically would change in your view around agenda-setting powers vis-a-vis the executive and Congress under the reforms you propose.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that presidents have a certain kind of informal agenda-setting authority by virtue of where they sit and the fact they give in their State of the Union speech that they give each year. They lay out, here are the things I'd like to see, and that helps shape the kinds of things that are talked about in Congress in important respects. We're talking about something more, which is the ability to formally introduce a bill that then Congress must vote on. And that's something that the president doesn't currently have. You flagged immigration policy as one particular domain. This is a reasonably clear case where it would have made a whole bunch of difference, not under this president, but under his predecessor. Obama had a comprehensive immigration reform. It had been put forward. It had passed the Senate. He was ready to sign on it. And then Majority Leader Boehner refused to bring it forward to a vote when all signs pointed towards Democrats nearly uniformly backing it and enough Republicans standing behind it that it would have gotten the majority votes it needed in order to pass. So this is a case where you would actually see a law which otherwise we couldn't get because the majority leader refused to bring it forward to a vote. There are going to be other instances too, where it's not that now by virtue of having this power, something is going to pass automatically. I think this is climate change legislation isn't going to automatically pass, but not under this president, but under the predecessor. Had he been able to say, vote on this, it would have been a hard vote for some members. And forcing legislators to debate meaningfully bills that are introduced by somebody who by institutional design is paying more attention to national considerations, isn't thinking, how do I protect this organized interest back home and that organized interest so that I can get reelected 2 years hence, but is thinking more about the nation as a whole and more about the long term, that will productively, to our minds, lead to a richer kind of deliberation about these hard problems. And it may change the composition of Congress, because what a thing that majority leaders do is they protect their members from these hard votes. And this cover would be lifted.
One of the other things that you've written about previously is the way in which the current situation outside of this administration, you've actually charted it over several recent administrations, actually creates a perversion of the legislative process by increasing the reliance on things like executive orders and other powers to the executive. So one of the questions here is, how do you control the presidential use of executive orders, executive power? It seems that presidents actually use those mechanisms to create their own agenda. What's the data and analysis show on the trend lines there and the challenges there?
Yeah, the trend lines point up. I mean, you see presidents exercising unilateral powers with rising frequency and more policy domains, and that those trend lines long precede Donald Trump. And so my first book, my doctoral dissertation, was about the politics of unilateral action and what do these checks look like. When you think about reimagining the presidency, and should we, shut down the ability of presidents to actually exercise these powers, this is a tough call, I want to say. Because on the one hand, they can clearly be used in ways that provide end runs around the legislative process, that introduce a kind of policy instability, such that the first thing a president will regularly do, a first thing that a Biden will do, right, and is under a Biden presidency, he'll undo unilaterally a whole bunch of things that Trump had previously done. Just as Trump had done the same thing and continues to do vis-a-vis Obama, which introduces a kind of policy instability we might not like, and that's a real problem. It also, though, is hard to imagine a president that has the executive power, that is charged with implementing laws that are notoriously vague, not having some kind of powers involving unilateral action. And there's sort of a long and rich history, too, of presidents providing clarity about the meaning of statutes or intervening in the aftermath of congressional gridlock in all kinds of policy domains. If you look at, the history of the prehistory of the 64 and 65 Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act were unilateral actions taken by presidents in the 40s and 50s. And so this is really a mixed bag. And so I think part of our discussion about emergency powers, which interacts with these unilateral powers, is how can we put some bounds on them? One more thing. Can I say one more thing, or am I going on too long? Can I?
We're good.
Okay, good. Let me say this other thing, which is that when we think about giving presidents certain kinds of powers and taking them away, these things interact with each other in important ways. A thing that happens right now when presidents exercise these unilateral powers and Congress is silent is that when they go over to the courts say, Congress is silent. We're going to infer into that silence tacit consent. Right? So no, they haven't said anything, but they could have expressed their opposition, but they didn't. And for that reason, the judiciary, as a check on presidents' unilateral powers, reliably underwhelms, right? It underperforms. A world in which the president could have the power to introduce something legislatively there's reason to believe that then courts would say, look, you could have introduced that thing, you didn't. And therefore, we're going to look more skeptically upon the exercise of those powers, right? And therefore, we're going to assert those checks that right now lay in abeyance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that way in which the third branch of government here actually takes a deeper look at what the executive is doing because of the expanded powers available to that person in the office. There are a number of questions about how might this work? How might you move forward? Julian writes, revising the Constitution seems like a nuclear option, I think, particularly in the divisive political environment that we exist right now. You talked in one case about some things that could be done by statute, but what are the mechanisms for implementing the kinds of reforms that you're proposing here?
There are a variety of them. Yeah, there are a variety of them. Some of these things can be done statutorily. There's a version of these agenda setting powers that I'm describing that could be done legislatively. They have been done legislatively. Vis-a-vis fast track authority and trade policy. That's enhanced agenda setting power of exactly the type that we have in mind, but it's confined to trade policy. And you could generalize to another policy domain, we think, without a constitutional amendment, to the extent that you want to make it not subject to kind of the whim goodwill of Congress to cede that authority, then you'd need a constitutional amendment, which can be done in a variety of different ways. It's not just about convening a new convention and all of the peril that invites. It can be done incredibly hard to do, clearly. But there are things that can be done legislatively. There is the constitutional amendment route. I'll say, interestingly, the kind of most profound changes to our politics that have proceeded through the constitutional route have had to do with concerns about representation. They haven't had to do with things about the structure of our institutions. This strikes us as a domain where institutional reformers, political reformers, people who care about our democracy they haven't done the work needed in order to keep our democracy alive and well. Some of that is going to have to do with lifting those heavy weights. And I'll say one last point on this, which is that, to the extent that there's a model, it's the progressive era of the late 19th and early 20th century, wherein all kinds of reforms were rolled out in an effort to improve the effectiveness of government. And I don't want to suggest that they got it right, or that the groundwork they laid for big government was the right thing, or that their solutions should be our solutions. I don't mean that. But what we saw in that period is that over long periods of time, people who care about our politics, businessmen, they were mostly men then, today there will be more women, politicos, journalists, academics come together and push hard through public dialogue and through political organization to affect change. And then the change came in fits and starts over decades. And I think that's what we need. I mean, that's what we need to rally for right now. We need a progressive movement for our times on our terms.
Yeah, there are two other pieces of this. I want to go deeper on the how, because I think we can't ignore the partisan nature of our politics and also the partisan incentives, as well as the kind of institutional incentives when you talk about Congress ceding power to the executive and vice versa. But I want to, you touched on something in passing. Before we go there, I just want to, you know, in terms of talking about effective government writ large, and the argument that you make in the diagnosis of the problem, you know, one of the other things that has been just ever present in American politics, certainly over the last 50 years, if not since the beginning of the country, has been this debate more recently between Democrats and Republicans, between liberals and conservatives, about not just whether government is effective, but it's been about what do we mean by effective government? Meaning, is there too much government?
Yes.
Right, that's the problem, that effective government means less government, or that we have the wrong kind of government or the wrong level of government. It needs to be at the local level versus the federal level. So what do you say about that argument and that debate that's coursed through American politics for so long? Your focus has been at the national level, principally.
Yes.
Federal level.
Hugely important. I mean, they're hugely important. The purposes of government are the legitimate subject of public disagreement. And we think long and hard about, in here, when we're talking about ineffective government, we're talking about a government that fails to attend to problems that, again, majorities recognize as a legitimate subject of public action. And I want to be clear here, Democrats and Republicans alike recognize the importance of having a government that can solve problems in all kinds of domains. The kind of libertarian critique that what we need is a tiny government that simply gets out of the business of attending to healthcare, attending to overseeing prescription drugs and tainted meat and worker safety. Like, in some important ways, that train has left the station. That said, this other additional point, though, is that even if all you want to do is scale back the reach of government, you too, conservative, dear conservative, and I want to note, I mean, my co-author, he's at Stanford and he works at the Hoover Institution. You think about the '86 tax cut under Reagan, right? Think about that, right? Which was one of his signature domestic policy achievements. What happened to that, right? What happened to that? What it does is it dramatically simplified the tax code and cut out all kinds of loopholes. And that what happened within 6 years is the number of income brackets, just as the number of loopholes that were filled up the tax code, escalated dramatically in the decade that followed, because Congress got its hands on it and all sorts of organized interest ensured that they were going to be protected. That if you're in the business of if you're in the business of curtailing the size of government, you ought to be in the business of having a government that can work well. So too, that those things needn't be in opposition to one another.
So just to reframe, and we're coming near the end, but to reframe, because I think we can get caught up in the present moment. You're saying that the situation in which the country finds itself on multiple levels, including the current presidential administration, is an outgrowth of much deeper, broader systemic challenges and the inability of our governmental system at the national level, at the federal level, to address the problems that have faced the country and in some cases face the entire planet holistically and effectively. And that solving for one particular administration actually misses the point. You're actually quite, I don't want to say downcast, but you issue an admonition to Democrats should they win the presidency in the November election, let alone retain their majority in the House or win control of the Senate. The Democrats could actually miss the opportunity and misdiagnose what ails us. So tell me, take the partisan view of this a bit more. What are the dangers of a Democratic victory across the board, and what are the opportunities that you see on both sides of this?
So the danger is, and I think it's a very real danger. I mean, we laid this out as not just a possibility, but there's some likelihood this is how it plays out, is that Democrats say, we dodged a bullet. Thank God Trump's out of office. Now let's take all of these conservative policies, make them liberal, and say we've restored some political order and we're well and good. The reason why that's a danger is that unless we reconstruct our institutions so that we can do a more effective job of solving the profound challenges that stand before this country, to not just do it, but do it well, to solve the problems, that this anger and this disaffection, which was there in 2016, is going to, if anything, grow, and it will be available for future populists who may well be more disciplined, more focused, more steadfast in their efforts to undermine our democracy to rise to power. That's the real danger. And so, yes, it's a big deal if the Democrats rise to power, but all their work lies ahead of them, and things stand in their way because they're going to operate in a political system in which there are all kinds of checks and limits on whoever sits in a position of power in order to coordinate and advance a policy agenda. One side. The other side is that we'll say is that we have a lot of discussion in here about the Republican Party and the changes in the Republican Party over the last 10 or 15 years. And one of the reasons why we're concerned about things productively moving forward is that populism isn't just channeled through Trump, it's taken hold of the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, we're concerned, is not going to be a partner in efforts to build a more effective government. They're not going to be partners in that. And so what you then need are Democrats to rise to power, because they're the one chance in order to build the kind of institutions that we need, and ensure that they keep their attention trained on the kind of long-term prize, when there are going to be all kinds of short-term pressures that they're going to be subject to. Will that happen? There's an opportunity, there's a chance. But again, go back to the progressive period. This is work that played out not just over years, but over decades. And I suspect that that's the way it'll have to be moving forward now. But if we don't set to that work, watch out. Because what has been revealed to us is just how vulnerable our democracy is.
We're running very short. I'm a few minutes over here, but very quickly, Will, is there something that we as citizens can and should be thinking about to advance the focus in the conversation that you're talking about tonight?
Get serious about talking amongst your friends and people in positions of influence about institutional reform. This is really, we need to carve out a space in our politics. And I'll say, I mean, a shout out to the center, which I've just launched this past year, the Center for Effective Government, to carve out a space where those kinds of conversations can happen, so that when we evaluate the people who occupy positions of power, we evaluate them in part on the attention that they give, the commitment that they offer to institutional reform. The institutions we have are not well suited to problem solving. We need to get into the business of reconstituting them.
The book is called Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy, co-written by William Howell and Terry Moe. Will, as he just mentioned, is director of the Center for Effective Government at the Harris School at the university. He's also the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago and chair of the Political Science Department. Will, thank you for this work. Thanks for the thought-provoking discussion and for the opportunity to be in conversation with all of you tonight.
It's
Mary?
great talking with you. This was lovely. Thanks, Steve.
I'll hand it back over to you, Mary.
Yeah.
Thank you. Will and Steve, thank you so much. What a timely, and Steve, I know you already used the term thought-provoking, but that lots to think about and lots to think about at the right time. So I know I speak for Will and Steve and myriad others at UChicago when I express deep gratitude to you, our Leaders in Philanthropy Giving Society members. Your partnership is absolutely vital, and we are so thankful for your generous, loyal support year after year. We hope to see you virtually again soon, and I look forward to the day when we can celebrate together in person. Thank you again.